So our gospel today is the story of Lazarus. And it's interesting when we get into the A part of the lectionary, which is what we're in, that normally has Matthew. But when we go into Lent, it offers us out of John, which are the I am passages. And when we start Lent, we start with Ash Wednesday, and we hear, "To dust we have come, and to dust we shall return." And so when we're in the first year of the Matthew and we're talking about John, we end Lent, or at least those 5 weeks leading into Holy Week, with Lazarus rising from the dead again. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. These are words that have been spoken for generations and generations and centuries. From dust you come, to dust you shall return. Singer-songwriter Paul Simon penned these words, and it's interesting that he did because Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel were actually cultural Jewish people, but they sang a lot about Christianity and what they said. So in their song it says, "God only knows, God makes his plan, the information is unavailable to the mortal man." Sounds very Calvinistic, doesn't it? God only knows, God makes his plan. So if we just live to die, and some people will tell you we start dying the moment we breathe our first breath, is that even living? Think about that. If we just live to die, is that even living? The band Kansas also has a song that talks about this. The wisdom that Kansas shares with us says, "Now, don't hang on. Nothing lasts forever but the earth and sky. It slips away, and all your money won't another minute buy. Dust in the wind. All we are is dust in the wind." And yes, now you will sing that chorus all day long. Dust in the wind, all we are is dust in the wind. In our gospel, we meet Martha, Lazarus' sister, and she's having a conversation with Jesus. And I would imagine it probably wasn't a very friendly one with Jesus at this time, because she's a little ticked off at him because she asked him to come and he waited to do that. And she says, "Lord, if you'd just been here, my brother would not have died." Now, I don't know about you when someone in your family dies, but I have not ever been known to be very rational when that happens to me and my family. And she says, "But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." So she's like saying, "It's all on you now, Jesus. You have got to come through this." Martha does not want Lazarus to just be dust in the wind. Martha wants her brother to be her brother. Our current Bibles attribute this conversation between Martha and Jesus. But there is a new as in the dissertation won't even be presented until this spring, but the dissertation is finished, and it is by Elizabeth Schroeder, and she is a New Testament scholar, and she is currently taking a class at Duke University. She's finishing her dissertation up, and so this is hot off the market. And I wasn't really going to preach about this until my son and I got into a really deep conversation, and he's out there in North Carolina right by Duke, and he goes, "Have you heard what's going on with this this particular verse? This is what her dissertation is about, the first 5 lines of today's gospel." So what she attributes this to is, and let me back up now. The entire Bible was not canonized initially. All they had were a whole bunch of papyruses, a whole bunch of different scripts. And so they would keep them and collect them together, and since they were all handwritten, they would not always say the exact same thing. I don't know about you, but when I'm writing your birthday notes to each and every one of you, sometimes you might see a place where I made a mistake and crossed it out. Well, that's what they're finding on these papyruses, is that the scribes were just human, and so oftentimes they would write something and then they would have to scratch it out. And so out of the top 20 papyruses that have been found, and one of them, papyrus number 66, has the best John passage, the most complete John passage, and it wasn't found until the late 1950s. So papyrus 66, when it came around, was really big news, but in it does not have the mention of Martha at all. It is strictly Mary. And out of the top 20 papyri, there are other ones that collaborate that Martha was an added addition. Now, this isn't uncommon, because if you look through the story of Jesus' resurrection in the book of Mark, it ends with Jesus being resurrected and the women there, and Jesus says, "Don't go tell anybody," and they don't. Yet, obviously, they did, because we know 2,000 years later. So it's not uncommon that things would be added. So Mrs. Schrader goes on to say that the reason that they took Mary, they added Martha to it, was because they wanted it in this male-dominated culture to have Peter be the person that the church was built on. And what her statement is that Peter and Mary Magdalene were equal disciples at that point in time. And so she goes on to say that Mary Magdalene, first of all, was not a prostitute. That didn't even come into being until a Catholic bishop said that somewhere in the early teens of the centuries, like 1200, 1100, 1300, somewhere in there. Mary Magdalene herself was a person. And Magdalene itself was, Mrs. Schroeder is saying that it's not a city, that she didn't come from Magdala, which they're saying is down around the Sea of Galilee, but nobody can find it. That Magdala means tower. And tower and power go together. So she probably was a fairly tall person, and that she was a very powerful individual. And there were two Lazarus, and she was the sister of the Lazarus that died. But this also means, without Martha there, that Martha was put in there to share the story. And that the Mary and Martha that you're going to find in the other scriptures were sisters, but that this particular one was in Bethany and was not in the earlier ones that were in the other Gospels. I know it's very confusing, but she is nitpicking it down for this dissertation. So what it really boils down to is that she's saying Mary Magdalene was the very first woman to realize, or the very first person to say, "I know that you are God." And that's what she's saying when her brother dies. She is also the very first person that sees Jesus at the woman that is at the foot of the cross when Jesus dies. She is also the Mary that is there at the tomb that goes and first sees that it's empty. And she is also the first person that Jesus appears to and says, "I have risen." That's Mary Magdalene is her dissertation in all four of those things. And that she and Peter go hand in hand as far as spreading the gospel at the time that that happened. And that the reason it's just coming out now is because we can just start beginning to understand it now. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that that's what her dissertation says. And this is starting to pop up, so when you hear about it, you can go, "Oh yes, we have heard about all of that." I'll be honest with you, I don't exactly know how to unpack it, and I have listened to the tape of this 3 times now, and it's still messing with my brain because it's going completely different than what I thought. But again, it's just something to think about. So according to Ms. Schroeder, the reading should say the first 5 verses. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, his sister. Now this was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore Mary sent to him Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. But when Jesus heard, he said to her, the sickness is not only unto death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister. So again, from Papyrus 66 and from the other ones she's been able to clump this through. So I lift that up. If you want to go find out some more about it, it's fascinating. If you're like me, you'll get caught in that rabbit hole and hours upon hours have disappeared and your head is still going, what did I just read? But so I lift that up to you. This is an important gospel because it's on this gospel that the entire reason that Jesus gets killed is because of this. You know, when he goes in and he helps the deaf guy here, that's okay. When he changes water into wine, that's pretty good, but the Pharisees are going around with that. When he gives sight to the man that was born blind, okay, if you notice at the beginning of this, the disciples have already pulled him out from people wanting to stone him. So they're already not happy with him. And then he raises someone back from the dead. And this is unbelievable. And it's at this point that the Pharisees get together and say, he's got to go. Now, even then, they didn't want to kill him. And we'll get that more on Maundy Thursday when he goes back and forth between the state and the religious people and who's going to kill him and all of that. But raising Lazarus is presented as a direct path to the cross. The other thing in my studies this time that I found is they're not saying that Lazarus is resurrected anymore. They're saying that he was resuscitated. Because when you're resurrected, you stay alive forever. And when you're resuscitated, you do eventually die at some point. So this is the resuscitation of Lazarus. I know. You're learning everything brand new, aren't you? You just thought you knew the Bible. But Lazarus, the illness of Lazarus did not lead to death, but to God's glory. And so that's what everything is pointing to, is the fact that Lazarus, the event caused so much and such a stir that it led to Jesus to the cross and to God's glory. So the I ams of John lighted this pathway to glory, lighted this pathway that goes straight up into heaven. Chapter 6 has the I am the bread of life, which means we are fed spiritually and figuratively. Chapter 8 and 9 says, I am the light of the world. We will never be left out in the dark. Chapter 10 says, I am the door or the gate to the sheep. We will always be protected. Chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. Christ will lead us and we need to listen. Chapter 11 is I am the resurrection and the life. It's our future and our present. Chapter 14, I am the way and the truth and the life. I will never change, and you can rely on me, is what Jesus is saying. And in chapter 15, I am the vine. I will offer nourishment and growth. And yes, we are dust in the wind. And all we are is dust in the wind. But we are also Jesus, who died on the cross for all of our sins, dust in the wind. And all God's people say, Amen.